Hey everyone, it's Colin, how's it going? The NES Classic and Super NES Classic have of course proven to be incredibly popular. But there's one other retro Nintendo console that I think if the company made a classic edition of, would prove to be even more exciting. This topic was suggested to me from a Twitter follower, and in some ways it's a little bit of a follow-up to a previous podcast episode that I did where I talked about what a supposed N64 Classic might look like. Would Nintendo even make one of those? Something like that. And towards the end of that episode, I proposed the concept of a Game Boy Classic. Now, of course, I'm not going to be the first one or the only one to suggest such a thing, but that idea has started to seemingly pick up a bit of steam lately. I've been seeing other people talking about, is Nintendo secretly working on a Game Boy Classic? Well, for the pedantic type, of course they're going to be secretly working on it. They want to surprise people about it. Most companies create their new products, quote unquote, in secret because they don't want to give either the competition a scoop or because for marketing reasons they want to surprise people. I have no doubt that Nintendo has at least thought about making a Game Boy Classic, but we still don't know if that's actually going to happen. It's an exciting idea because while the N64 Classic would certainly prove to be interesting to fans of that console and probably even fans of Nintendo in general, in some ways though it becomes a little bit predictable, right? We've already seen the NES Classic and the Super NES Classic, and the next in line if you're looking at Nintendo's home consoles would be the N64. So we'd already know what it would be like, what it would be capable of, even before it was announced, right? But a Game Boy Classic gives Nintendo a real opportunity if it chose to make one, because we've seen major advances in portable technology since when the original Game Boy was made, right? This thing, comparatively speaking, is fairly compromised. Internally, it's basically an NES. It's an 8-bit based system, but the screen technology was pretty limited back in the 80s when the Game Boy was announced. And sound quality has, of course, kind of, come into its own in the form of chiptunes. People have actually embraced the way that the Game Boy sounds. But at the same time, sound quality has gotten better since then, and screen technology, of course, gotten better since then. Battery life, size, physical size, things are much smaller than this now and offer way more power and features and functionality. But there's still, of course, a charm to the original Game Boy. So, like with the NES and Super NES Classic, Nintendo would be feeding off of nostalgia, of course, but I feel like there's a real opportunity for Nintendo to really wow people if it chose to create a classic version of the Game Boy. So this episode, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of brainstorming, thinking up all the different possibilities that Nintendo could have in a supposed, Game Boy Classic. What could it do? What would it keep the same? What would it change? Just kind of, thinking out loud. Of course, I know you're going to have some ideas of your own, and I encourage you to shout them out down in the comments below in case there's anything that I didn't think of or maybe you disagree with. But you know what? Let's get started and just have some fun with this one. The first thing to think about is going to be actually the form factor. I think it's probably a given that Nintendo would likely go for the original DMG design and shape and size and everything, but that's not the only option it has. If you're looking at the original Game Boy lineup, there's really three primary models: the DMG, the Game Boy Pocket, and then the Game Boy Color. And each, of course, has its own fans. And based on the response that I've seen to other videos about the topic, I know the Game Boy Color fans would be very, very interested in getting their hands on a console that's just like that. But I think probably for marketing and nostalgia reasons and everything, the original DMG would win out just because it's probably the most recognizable design. It's got the most classic kind of retro Nintendo appearance. And so likely Nintendo would go that direction. Of those three consoles, my favorite actually is the Game Boy Pocket. I like its size and shape. It just feels like it's a more efficient console. The screen quality is better. It only takes 2 batteries instead of 4. It is physically smaller and lighter, yet the screen size is the same. It really feels like a refined design. While the Game Boy Color is totally awesome, and don't get me wrong, I love the Game Boy Color and the games and the improvements that it had, it feels in some ways like a step backwards because the screen itself got a little bit smaller, the body got a bit bigger. It feels a little bit less refined, less progressive in terms of design and efficiency and everything. So for me, I think a Game Boy Pocket would actually be really cool as a classic console. But like I said, the original DMG would likely be it for, what Nintendo would want to make a classic console out of. From there, we've got pretty much all the insides to think about. Now, I think it's pretty clear that Nintendo would take a page from its own playbook and continue on with the same architecture that it's been using for those NES and Super NES classics. The ARM-based chip where it just plays all the games in emulation. That's a very simple, straightforward design. The only difference really between the NES and Super NES classics was just the software loaded on it. The hardware for the most part was the same on the inside. Now, they would of course need to re-engineer that board to fit in the shell of a DMG. And of course they'd want to optimize it for power efficiency as well, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on here. But I think the same basic concept would work. The ARM-based chip running a very thin Linux operating system with an emulator running on top and a whole bunch of preloaded ROMs. Makes simple sense. But where do you go from there? What does the UI look like? How do you interact with a thing like that in a handheld form factor? Well, that's going to lead us to something like the screen. What kind of screen would you put in a Game Boy Classic? If you wanted to stay really true to the original, you'd go with a simple, reflective, black and white display. But, this being 2017, a product like that would likely come out in 2018, if not later. The appetite for a seemingly low quality display like that, I don't think would be very much. People wouldn't want something like that. So we would definitely need to go with a screen that's a bit more modern. Well, how much more modern and what capabilities would you want? Well, they could easily find at least a backlit black and white screen if they wanted to throw that in there. And that would make, I think, a decent number of people happy. But you might as well just go all the way and put a color screen in there. And that gives you some additional options in that now the menus and everything can be in color. Yeah, the original games, if you're throwing just titles that came out close to launch or when the DMG was a current product, if you're just throwing those titles in there, then a black and white screen would be all you need. And of course, the games could continue to play in black and white on a color display. But sticking a color display in a console like that then gives you the flexibility to put titles from the next series, the Game Boy Color, in there as well. Admittedly, it would be kind of weird to play Game Boy Color games in color on a handheld that looks like this. But at the same time, I couldn't see Nintendo creating new versions of the classic console for every single iteration, right? The Game Boy to Game Boy Color era, there was a big difference there, but the difference really was just going from black and white to color, right? There wasn't any real improvement in performance. There wasn't any improvement in graphics quality in terms of complexity of stuff. It really just felt like with the Game Boy Color, they simply added color, and that was it. So, in some ways, I think people would accept playing Game Boy Color games on a DMG, look-alike classic console. And it certainly would help Nintendo with options for bolstering out the titles it would include on a handheld like that. So I think, Nintendo could go a couple ways with the screen, but my bet would be that a backlit color display would probably be the most feasible. It would also give Nintendo the best options in terms of finding a part, right? Like, I don't think there are all that many black and white, high quality backlit displays out there in the marketplace compared to color ones. So Nintendo would be able to find probably a stock part available, from a manufacturer and use it in a console like that, and which would save them money instead of having to design something that didn't otherwise exist, get a custom part made. That would drive their costs up. But there's some other things we could think about with a console like that. Power, of course, they need to optimize for power because now you don't have the wall socket powering the device like with the home consoles. You're going to need this thing to be portable for on-the-go kind of use. So first question is, what kind of battery do you put in there? Well, to go true to the original, you'd put a battery compartment in the back where people could stick 4 AA's in there. But, I think we're at the point where disposable batteries or, AA, AAA kind of batteries, they're starting to really go by the wayside. I feel like a lot of devices that we buy these days just come with a built-in rechargeable battery. And for efficiency's sake, for environmental concerns, for ongoing ease of use concerns, that's probably the better way to go. So I think Nintendo would be best served by sticking a lithium-ion battery pack in a console like that instead of relying on something like AA's. But there's a good opportunity here in that Nintendo could use an existing battery design as well. And the first thing that came to mind would be the battery pack from the Game Boy Advance SP. It wouldn't take much for Nintendo to spin up an assembly line to create more batteries like that. And because it's a simpler part, then they'd be able to use that going forward if they ever created something like a Game Boy Advance Classic. But they could also use it as spare parts, for people who want to buy new batteries for their own original GBA SP. So maybe something along those lines would make a lot of sense. Just have it be a modular design. Maybe there would be a door on the back. You could take that one out when it eventually failed and put a new one in. I think that something like that could make a lot of people happy. Of course, Nintendo could also consider just sticking kind of a permanent lithium-ion battery on the inside that you couldn't easily remove and service and replace. And that'd be a disappointment, I think, from a repairability concern, but we're already used to that in things like smartphones and tablets. So in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't really hurt, I don't think, for them to go that way. But power efficiency is also going to be a concern, right? They would want to get a display that's power efficient, but they'd also need to make sure that the processing and everything in there is power efficient as well, because it's no good to sell this classic console if it only gets 2 or 3 hours of runtime off of a charge. But that said, we've seen some major advancements in power efficiency within these ARM-type CPUs. So I have no doubt that Nintendo would be able to pull it off and actually get really, really good battery life out of a console like that. Just rough guess off the top of my head, I'd figure that with a lithium-ion pack, you'd probably see a good 8 to 12 hours out of something like a Game Boy Classic, even with a color screen. There's just that base, inherent efficiency already there in the architecture. It really wouldn't take Nintendo a whole lot much more effort to be able to just make sure that you get a respectable number of hours of gameplay out of it. The form factor, other than the external appearance, I think would likely stay the same. I couldn't foresee Nintendo sticking anything like shoulder buttons on one of these so that they could stick Game Boy Advance games on here. I think they really would stick to the 8-bit era of, Game Boy and Game Boy Color titles. So on the outside, this console would generally, I think, look pretty much the same buttons and the same layout. There'd probably still just be the single speaker in there. Maybe Nintendo would keep the headphone jack on the bottom, if anything, for nostalgia's sake. Although, as we've discussed, it's probably been a while now, the industry is kind of starting to move away from the analog headphone jack. And would Nintendo still be, would it still be in their best interest to include one? I think popular opinion would say yes, but at the same time, like with smartphone manufacturers, they could probably get away with not having it on there, provided that they include another option. That other option would also be related to this port on the side, the link port. And this is where we start getting into kind of the pie in the sky, or the wants and not so much the needs out of what a Game Boy Classic would be like. And that there's opportunities that Nintendo could take to have the console be even better than what the original one was, right? Just if all they did was swap out the screen and the guts inside for something more modern, yeah, that'd be fine. And I think a lot of people would still buy it. But there's an opportunity for Nintendo to go further. So the first thing that I can think of is the link port on the side. There were a decent number of Game Boy games that had two-player mode, and you'd get the classic link port cable, and you'd hook a couple of consoles up, like you and a friend, and you could play head-to-head on your own handhelds. Well, in 2017, 2018, would we even want to deal with a cable to do, player versus player kind of stuff? No, I don't think we'd want to do that. I think it would be in Nintendo's best interest to delete this port on a Game Boy Classic and instead go with something like Bluetooth. That would open up a lot of possibilities, of course. You'd be able to go two-player or more with a Bluetooth link, so that'd be a lot more convenient. Plus, then you could add on other capabilities, like with the headphone jack on the bottom. Instead of the headphone jack, you could give the option for syncing Bluetooth headphones for audio. Now, they'd probably leave the headphone jack on there anyway. There's no harm in doing both, but the circuitry to add Bluetooth these days is actually pretty inexpensive. If you're a member of the DIY kind of community, these little Bluetooth modules are just a few bucks. And at large capacity, like Nintendo would be making a Game Boy Classic, it would be even cheaper. So, other than a very slight increase in the build of materials cost, it would really just be software that Nintendo would have to invest in to get Bluetooth two-player mode, for example, working on a console like this. And that could be as simple as like a little pass-through piece of software where if the game itself is looking to communicate over the link port, Nintendo just writes software that has the Bluetooth radio kind of look like the link port to the game. I think it'd be a pretty seamless and slick way to do it. And it would give you that kind of value add that makes you feel like what you're buying is more than just a rehash of the original. It gives you new features, new functionality. And that's not new for Nintendo, right? You look at the NES Classic and the Super NES Classic. At face value, it's just a box with some preloaded games that you hook up to your TV and play. But you dig a little bit deeper, and there's some extra stuff in there. Specifically, the ability to do save states. And with the SNES Classic, the ability to kind of rewind in time to replay a section. So it wouldn't necessarily be out of character, I think, for Nintendo to go with additional features on a classic console like that. It wouldn't be something that we hadn't seen before. They would need to give you some sort of value add. In the very least, a Game Boy Classic would offer, I think, something like save states. But adding Bluetooth two-player or Bluetooth audio would be a really big help. Another thing that they could add that I think would go over really well would be video out. It wouldn't cost very much to throw an HDMI port on the console, maybe somewhere up on the top. And there would be a little bit of extra plastic to play with because Nintendo simply wouldn't need the cartridge slot on a Game Boy Classic. There would be no cartridges to stick in there. How they wanted to deal with this portion of the design, I think they could go a couple of ways. They could either leave the cutout as it is and just blank it off at the part where you stick the cartridge in, or they could actually fill it in and give you a bigger, more full back, which would give more room inside for the circuit board and battery and stuff. But it would also give you a really convenient place on the top to stick a full-size HDMI port. I think that would go over really well because while the console itself is a classic design and shape and generally has proven to be fairly ergonomic over the years, the screen size still by today's standards is pretty small, right? It's just a couple inches. We're used to smartphone screens that are approaching 6 inches in size. You know, a Game Boy screen that's barely 2-ish inches in diagonal is going to be comparatively small. So while on the go, I'm sure it would be fine. If you wanted to sit around at home and play these classic Game Boy games, a video out would be very welcome. And of course, you would get a lot of the features, I think, like you could get out of something like the Super Game Boy that came out for the Super NES way back in the day, where you'd have the ability to maybe add a color palette to a black and white game and customize the borders and, you know, all of that other kind of stuff for when you are putting that smaller image on a bigger display. You know what I mean? But in the very least, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And of course, there's a huge game library for Nintendo to pick through. I wouldn't even be able to begin to guess as to what a library like that would look like. Of course, we'd see Mario, we'd see maybe a couple of sports titles. The one that I would love to see on there, of course, is Tetris. I think that's an iconic game for the Game Boy. The real question is, would Nintendo be able to license it, or at least license it at an appropriate cost? Because that's going to be the real clincher for producing a console like this. Nintendo has to keep the retail price in mind, but also its own build cost in mind. And that's where things start to get a little bit tricky with a console like this. The NES Classic, the Super NES Classic, were actually relatively inexpensive for Nintendo to make from a hardware perspective, right? It's really just a single circuit board inside of a plastic box. That circuit board probably cost them at scale maybe $10, you know, maybe a little more. The controllers are probably a couple bucks each to manufacture. The real cost that Nintendo is paying out is going to be in the license fees for the games that it includes. And I think Nintendo's probably making a decent margin on all of the NES and Super NES Classic sales, but I don't think it's an incredible margin. I don't think they're, you know, making even, you know, 50% profit margin on a console like that. My guess is it's probably closer 25 to 30%. Any less than that, and Nintendo financially, it wouldn't really make sense for them to even do it. But with the Game Boy Classic, Nintendo would have to be really careful about parts costs, because a device like this would inherently cost more for them to build than an NES or Super NES Classic, simply because there's more involved in this, right? Not just the circuit board and the casing, but now you've got a screen that you've got to pay for in there. There would be a battery in there that they would have to pay for. There would potentially be the add-on bells and whistles, like the Bluetooth modem radio combo. You know, if they wanted to do the wireless 2-player, if they wanted HDMI out, they'd have to design that into the board. And then, of course, on top of that, you'd have the costs for the game licensing for whatever titles you chose to put on here. So the overall build of materials cost for Nintendo would be higher, and that's going to be reflected in the retail price. You know, people, I think at first were a little sensitive to the $80 price tag, at least here in the US, that the Super NES Classic went for, but things kind of got smoothed over when it was announced that there were going to be 2 controllers included in the box. And then even though there were fewer games included in the Super NES version than the original NES version, you got Star Fox 2, so that was another kind of so-called value add that they threw in there. So I feel like people were okay with an $80 price tag. Would Nintendo be able to manufacture a Game Boy Classic at a price and including a margin that would let them sell it at retail for $80? I think that might be tough, to be honest. My guess is that a hardware bill of materials on something like one of these would probably be $35 to $40. Just rough guess. Maybe they'd come up with ways to make it cheaper. Maybe they'd be able to find more commodity parts that would drive the cost down lower. Maybe they could get away with lower quality parts. Maybe they could get away with a less expensive screen, or maybe they have better ways to design the circuit board to be more efficient, from a parts cost perspective. They might be able to drive it down a little bit, but if their build cost is like $30 for the hardware, $35 for the hardware maybe, and then they're spending another $30 per unit in licensing for the games that they wanted to put on it, well, that's going to push you past an $80 retail price. So I think that retail price might be the one thing that would make or break whether a Game Boy Classic even gets manufactured. They'd have to figure out a way to find the perfect balance of features and functionality to price to be able to make it happen. Would there be a decent number of people who would line up and buy a Game Boy Classic if it was at $100? I think probably. But at the same time, at $100, now you're starting to encroach on the territory of the 3DS platform, right? And then you'd start to have arguments about, well, why don't I just have virtual console titles of all those games for the 3DS? Why wouldn't Nintendo just sell a really cheap pack of, those classic games for the virtual console and the 3DS and just call it done? Do it as a software only kind of a thing. So my gut tells me that $80 is kind of the sweet spot for pricing on a classic device like that. Any more than $80 and the value may just not be there. Even if the hardware itself is whiz-bang and totally amazing and blows people's minds, on some level, people are still going to be like, okay, yeah, this is a totally cool thing and I really want one, but it's still a bunch of old games that I may already even have copies of. Do I really want to drop $100 on something like that? Like I said, in some ways, $80 was even kind of starting to push it with the Super NES Classic. So the pricing, again, I feel is really going to be what kind of comes down to whether Nintendo even makes a Game Boy Classic or not. But I do hope they do it. I think it would be really exciting and really interesting, and it would maybe give some more life to those classic titles. There were plenty of Game Boy fans and everything out there, but the first thing you think of when somebody says Nintendo, at least to the average person, is probably something like the NES or the Super NES. So going with the Game Boy Classic would bring some more attention back to classic handheld gaming, retro handheld gaming, and all the amazing stuff that was going on with it in parallel with the home consoles. So I think it'd be exciting, but as they say, only time will tell as to whether it actually happens. So I am, of course, curious as to your thoughts. I imagine a lot of you would be excited about a console like this, but do you think it's even going to happen? What would it look like? What features would it have? And then what do you think would be some of the really important kind of core games that would have to be bundled with a Game Boy Classic, whether they stick with just black and white or include the Game Boy Color library? What do you think would be something, a few titles that Nintendo would just have to include to be representative of what handheld gaming was like in the late 80s and early 90s? So I'm just curious as to your thoughts. Be sure to shout those out down in the comments below. So if you liked the episode, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.